Welcome to Frozen Fears, scary stories for a rainy night. If you're new here, here's what you can expect. True scary stories paired with some of the best rain sounds to help you relax or fall asleep. These videos are perfect for winding down when nothing else seems to work. The true stories might keep you hooked for a while, so get comfortable, grab a blanket, and cozy up. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's begin. I'd always been cautious with online dating, never fully trusting the connections I made through dating apps. But when Claire messaged me, her profile seemed genuine. Her smile was warm, and her interests were eerily similar to mine. Books, hiking, music. It felt like fate. We started talking. At first, it was small talk, just like any other conversation on a dating app. But Claire quickly stood out. Her messages were thoughtful, witty, and we seemed to click in ways that I hadn't expected. We decided to meet in person after a few weeks of chatting. The meeting went well, too. She was charming, funny, and just as attractive in real life as she was in her pictures. After at night, she started texting me constantly. It was flattering at first, but it soon became overwhelming. At first, I didn't think much of it. I thought she was just excited, just as I was. But then things started to get weird. One evening, as I was heading to the grocery store, I noticed a car parked across the street from my building. The car was old, unremarkable, and blended into the background, but something about it caught my attention. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a coincidence. Later that night, Claire texted me, asking, "Did you get your groceries?" I froze. I hadn't told her I was going to the store. I hadn't mentioned anything about my evening plans at all. When I asked her how she knew, she responded, "I saw you. You look cute with your new jacket." I laughed it off, telling myself I was overthinking things. Maybe she had seen me on the way out, or maybe it was a coincidence. But then, the next morning, I woke up to a text from her that said, "I hope you slept well. You looked really peaceful last night." Confused and slightly unsettled, I checked my phone's camera roll to see if I had accidentally taken a picture while sleeping, but no such photo existed. My heart started racing. Could she have been watching me while I slept? I didn't know what to think. Things only escalated from there. One day, I returned to my apartment to find a small bouquet of flowers on my doorstep. There was no note attached, just the flowers. I asked Claire about it, and she simply said, "I thought you'd like them." I tried to brush it off, but a sense of dread settled in my stomach. This wasn't normal. It felt too intimate, too personal. I tried to ignore my growing unease, but then the messages started coming at all hours. I'd wake up to dozens of texts. "I miss you. I'm thinking of you. You look so handsome today. I saw you at the coffee shop." Each time she would mention seeing me somewhere, I would try to remember if I'd ever told her I was going to that specific location, but I hadn't. She was always where I was somehow. Then came the phone calls. Every time I ignored her texts or didn't respond immediately, she would call me. The calls were silent, just her breathing on the other end. I blocked her number, but the calls kept coming from different numbers. When I finally confronted her about it, she said, "I just wanted to hear your voice." I was terrified, but I didn't know how to make her stop. That's when I started noticing things. My apartment felt off. It wasn't just the flowers or the texts anymore. Things would be slightly out of place, like someone had been inside my apartment. A lamp would be turned slightly. The couch cushions moved in a way that wasn't how I left them. I started checking my locks obsessively, but each time I checked, I had the overwhelming feeling that someone had been watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire had somehow gained access to my life in a way that wasn't possible through just online chatting. My suspicions were confirmed one night when I returned home to find my front door slightly ajar. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open, half expecting to see her standing in the hallway. But there was nothing. I went straight to the police, but they couldn't do anything. They said there was no evidence of a crime being committed, just some unsettling behavior, but nothing illegal. I didn't know what to do. I was scared to go outside, scared to be alone in my own apartment. Then one night, I decided to confront Claire. I texted her, telling her I wanted to meet at the park, just to talk. I needed to know what was going on, to get some answers. She agreed, and we met there under the dim lights of the park bench. I was nervous, my hands shaking as I waited for her to arrive. When she did, she smiled at me, that same warm, inviting smile. But there was something in her eyes, something dark, something unsettling. She sat down next to me and said, "I know this is hard for you, but I just want us to be together. I can't let you go. I've been following you for so long, and I'm not going to stop. You and I, we're meant to be." My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. I stood up, backing away from her, my mind racing. How had I not seen it before? How had I not realized she had been stalking me from the start? As I turned to leave, she grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "You'll never escape me. I know where you live. I know your routines. I know everything about you." I yanked my arm free and ran, not looking back until I was safely inside my apartment. I haven't seen Claire since that night, but I still feel her presence. The feeling that someone's watching me, waiting for me to slip up. And every so often, I get a text from an unknown number that simply reads, "I'm still here." I changed my phone number and moved to a different apartment, hoping that would be the end of it. I thought I could finally get away from Claire, that her obsession with me would fade, and I could live in peace again. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't free. A few months passed. The new apartment was quiet, safe, and I made sure to keep my life as private as possible. I didn't use social media, didn't join any new dating apps, and avoided the places I used to frequent. It was exhausting, but I had to do it for my peace of mind. Then, one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I received a text from an unknown number. "I'm always watching." My heart dropped. It was her. There was no doubt in my mind. Even after all this time, after everything I had done to erase any trace of my life from her reach, she had found me again. I tried to block the number, but she was smart. She kept using different numbers, different apps. Every few weeks, I get another message, another reminder that she was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The messages became more cryptic and twisted. "You think you can escape me? I've been here longer than you know." I started feeling paranoid again, like I was back where I had started. It felt like I was being suffocated by her presence, even though I couldn't see her. Every shadow seemed to hide her. Every rustling in the hallway sounded like her footsteps. Every knock at the door sent my heart into overdrive. And then one night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. I was in bed, the room dark and quiet. But then, a faint sound came from outside my window. It was soft, almost like a whisper. I crept to the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. I peered out into the street, but the only thing I saw was the empty sidewalk. I opened the window slightly, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft whisper, like someone calling my name. I closed the window quickly, my mind racing. I knew deep down that she was out there, waiting, watching, maybe even smiling at my fear. I was no longer sure if she was even human anymore, or if she had become something darker, something more terrifying. For the first time, I realized that escaping her wasn't going to be as simple as changing apartments or blocking her number. She was in my head, in my every thought. The only way she could truly leave me alone was if I disappeared completely, erased every trace of myself from the world. But would even that work? Would she ever truly let me go? I don't know. The fear of knowing I might never be safe again is a constant shadow hanging over me. And even now, as I sit in my new apartment, I can't shake the feeling that Claire is watching me, somewhere out there, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the days dragged on, I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The more I tried to ignore it, the more I felt her presence lurking, like a dark cloud hanging over my life. I couldn't relax, couldn't feel safe anywhere. Every noise at night, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, made me jump. One evening, I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. I needed to get out of the apartment, away from the oppressive feeling that had taken over. The streets were quiet, just like always, and the cool night air did little to calm my nerves. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that she would be behind me, following me like a shadow. When I turned a corner, I saw something that made my blood freeze. There, standing across the street, was a figure. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but I knew instinctively who it was. Even from a distance, I could feel the chill of fear creep down my spine. It was Claire. She was standing there, staring at me with that haunting smile on her face, the one I had come to know all too well. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, fast and determined. I didn't dare look back. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran faster, my legs screaming in protest. But the fear pushed me forward. I burst into my building, slamming the door behind me and locking it as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the locks, but I didn't stop until I felt the security of the door being bolted shut. I leaned against it, my chest heaving, trying to calm my racing heart. But the terror wasn't over. I could still hear her footsteps in my mind, still feel her eyes on me. I couldn't escape her, no matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I changed my life. She was everywhere, always just out of reach, waiting for me to slip up. I went up to my apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The walls seemed to close in around me. I locked every window, checked the door locks, and even moved the furniture in front of the windows for extra security. But it didn't matter. I could still feel her presence. It was like she had left a mark on everything I touched, every place I tried to hide. I sat on the couch, staring at my phone, willing it to ring, to give me some sign of normalcy. But it stayed silent. Then, out of nowhere, a text message popped up. "I know where you are." My blood ran cold. There was no name, no number, just that chilling message. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. How could she know? I had been so careful, kept everything so private. I picked the phone up again, staring at the message, my mind racing with questions. The room felt so much smaller now, suffocating. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't keep living like this. But I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't outrun her. Not now. Not ever. And then, my phone buzzed again. Another message. "You can run, but I'll always be watching. Always." I collapsed back onto the couch, my mind reeling. How could I escape someone who seemed to know everything about me? Someone who was always just one step ahead? I tried to convince myself to be calm, to think rationally, but fear gripped me. I realized I was no longer in control of my own life. Claire had taken that from me a long time ago. The only thing left for me to do now was wait. Wait for the next message, the next encounter, the next moment when she decided to show up. Because no matter what I did, she would always be there, watching from the shadows. And deep down, I knew she would never stop. I spent the next few days in a constant state of dread, each moment heavier than the last. I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak of the floorboards or car engine outside made me jump, thinking she was here. The feeling of being watched never left me. I kept my curtains closed, the lights dim, and the doors locked. But it felt like nothing would protect me from her. My thoughts were consumed by Claire. Who was she? Why was she doing this? I'd never known her outside of the dating app, never had a real conversation. How could someone I barely knew suddenly become so obsessed with my every move? And how did she find me? I had blocked her on the app, so she shouldn't have been able to contact me, let alone stalk me in person. One night, I decided to take action. I couldn't live like this anymore. I wasn't going to let her control my life, but I had no idea what I could do. I could go to the police, but would they take me seriously? After all, I had no proof, just vague threats and strange messages. They would probably brush me off as overreacting. I couldn't let it go that far, though. I couldn't wait until it was too late. That night, I called a private investigator, hoping they could track down Claire and help me understand how she was getting to me. I needed answers. I needed to know how she had gotten so close to me so quickly. The investigator was calm, reassuring. He said he'd need a few days to gather information, but he promised to dig into it and find out who Claire really was. It gave me a glimmer of hope, something to hold onto in the chaos. But even as I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire was already one step ahead. I went to bed that night, exhausted but too scared to sleep. The hours ticked by, and my anxiety gnawed at me. I tried to keep my mind off of everything, but the feeling of dread grew stronger. The silence of my apartment was suffocating. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Another message. I know you're waiting for someone to help you, but no one can save you. Not from me. It felt like a knife slicing through the air. My stomach turned. She was watching me again. I looked around the room, almost expecting her to be standing in the doorway, her eyes glowing in the dark. But no, the room was empty, just the same as always. Yet the tension in the air was undeniable. I felt trapped, like a bird in a cage with no way out. I didn't even know where to hide anymore. That's when I noticed something strange, something I hadn't seen before. The curtains were open just a sliver. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized that I hadn't left them like that. Someone had moved them. Someone had been in my apartment. I rushed to the window, yanking the curtains open completely. The street outside was empty, but my pulse didn't slow. My hand trembled as I shut the curtains tightly, locking the window again. It felt like an invasion, as if she was toying with me, letting me know she could get to me anytime she wanted. I grabbed my phone, intent on calling the investigator, but as I unlocked the screen, another message popped up. You've made a mistake. You've tried to get away from me, and now you will pay. The words burned into my mind, leaving a cold emptiness in their wake. I stared at the screen, hands frozen. Was she in my apartment right now? Was she watching me through the very curtains I had just checked? I didn't know what to think anymore. I couldn't trust anything, and I couldn't stop wondering if I was losing my mind. Or was this real? Was Claire really stalking me, closing in with every passing day? In that moment, I realized something horrifying. Claire had been in my life much longer than I'd thought, maybe even before I had noticed her presence. She had wormed her way into my mind, into my fears. She wasn't just stalking me. She was controlling me, playing with my sense of reality, and I didn't know how to fight back. The only thing I could do was wait. Wait for her next move, for the next terrifying text, for the next time she decided to reveal herself. Because I knew one thing for sure now. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The days blurred together. Each one felt heavier than the last, filled with fear, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. I couldn't trust my own thoughts anymore. Claire was everywhere, lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, playing her twisted game. I kept in touch with a private investigator, but his updates were slow. He had traced her online activity to some fake accounts and an anonymous email address, but there were no solid leads yet. It felt like Claire was always one step ahead, always vanishing before she could be caught. I started noticing things I hadn't before, little details that sent my heart racing every time. My front door, which I always made sure to lock, seemed to click slightly when I returned home, as though it had been opened and closed recently. My mail would sometimes arrive with small items missing or moved around. A photo I had on the wall, something simple, had shifted slightly, as though someone had adjusted it when I wasn't looking. One morning, I went to grab a glass of water, only to find my kitchen light on. I was sure I had turned it off the night before. I hadn't heard any footsteps, hadn't seen anyone in the house, but the light was on. The tightness in my chest worsened as I realized just how deeply she had infiltrated my life. I couldn't shake the thought. Was she in my house right now, watching me, listening to every breath I took? I had to know. I started setting up cameras in every room, security cameras hidden from plain sight, so I could monitor my home 24/7. I hoped that by capturing footage of her, I could finally prove what was happening. Finally, something that would make all this real, something that would break the nightmare. The first night the cameras were set up, I barely slept, my eyes glued to the small monitor I had placed next to my bed. Every few minutes, I checked the feed, praying for some sign that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going to find peace. At 3 a.m., I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the kitchen camera, there she was, Claire, standing in the middle of my kitchen, just staring at the camera. Her eyes were wide open, dark and hollow, as though she was waiting for me to notice her. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. How had she gotten inside? I hadn't heard a single sound. The door had been locked. The windows were secure. But there she was, standing in my kitchen, grinning with a twisted smile. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to move, but I was paralyzed with fear. The camera feed flickered for a second, and when it cleared, she was gone, as if she had vanished into thin air. I checked the other cameras. No sign of her anywhere else in the house, but I knew what I had seen. I grabbed my phone and called the private investigator again, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't stop the panic from rising in my chest as I told him everything. About the cameras, about Claire, about the nightmare I was living. He promised he'd look into it, but I didn't feel reassured. What if Claire was already onto me? What if she knew I was trying to trap her, to expose her? What if I had already made a mistake? I didn't wait for his reply. I was too scared to stay in my apartment any longer. I packed a small bag, grabbed my phone, and left in the middle of the night, heading to a friend's house far out of town. I felt safer there, but not for long. The peace I had hoped for didn't last. The next morning, as I checked my phone, I saw the message from Claire. You can run, but you can't hide. I'll always find you. I dropped my phone, my body going cold with terror. It wasn't enough. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, Claire was always one step ahead. She was in my head, my thoughts, my life. And she wasn't going anywhere. I didn't know how to escape this madness. I didn't know how to stop her. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about stalking anymore. It had become a game of survival. And I was losing. I couldn't keep running forever. I knew it, deep down. No matter how many new places I tried to hide in, Claire would always find me. She was relentless. A shadow that clung to my every move. A constant, gnawing presence in the background of my life. I couldn't live in fear anymore. I needed to confront this head-on, even if it meant facing my worst nightmare. I returned to my apartment the next day, my heart heavy with dread. I knew Claire was watching, waiting for me to come back. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't let her control my every move. I had to take back my life. Before stepping inside, I double-checked the security cameras I'd installed. Every angle of my apartment was covered. If she tried anything again, I would catch her. This time, I would be ready. The first few hours in my apartment were tense, every creak and groan of the building making my pulse race. I stayed near the door, watching the cameras and waiting for any sign of movement. My phone was glued to my hand, ready to call the authorities or the private investigator at a moment's notice. Then, just as the sun began to set, something happened. A message appeared on my phone. I know you're watching, and I'm waiting for you to make the first move. It was from Claire. I could feel the walls closing in around me. How did she know? How could she have possibly known that I was waiting for her, that I was trying to trap her? A cold, rational part of my mind tried to calm me down. It was just a message, a threat, nothing more. But the rest of me couldn't shake the feeling that she was toying with me, playing her sick game. The hours dragged on, but nothing happened. No more messages. No more signs of her. I couldn't help but wonder if I had overreacted, if I was just imagining things, if my paranoia was starting to take over. That night, I went to bed exhausted, both mentally and physically. Sleep was elusive, but eventually I drifted off, the weight of everything finally catching up with me. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound, a faint noise, like something shifting in the other room. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, listening intently. The air was thick with silence, save for the soft hum of the fridge in the kitchen. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed, my hands trembling. There was movement in the hallway, but it wasn't just a shadow this time. It was her, Claire. She was standing at the edge of the hallway, watching me. Her eyes gleamed in the dark, and her smile twisted into something dark and sickening. The camera feed glitched for a second, but I saw enough. She wasn't just lurking anymore. She was here. I froze. My blood ran cold as the reality of the situation hit me. I wasn't alone. She had made her way into my apartment somehow. No sign of forced entry. No unlocked doors or windows. Just her. I scrambled to grab something, anything, to protect myself. My hands found a metal lamp on the nightstand, and I gripped it tightly, ready to defend myself. But as I turned back toward the hallway, I heard her voice. Soft, almost playful. I told you, you can't hide from me. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I ran for the door, but as I reached for the handle, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. The touch sent a jolt of panic through my body. I turned around, swinging the lamp with all the force I could muster. It hit something. No, someone. Claire's laugh echoed through the apartment, sharp and cruel. She didn't even flinch as the lamp collided with her, as if she were made of stone. "Why are you running?" she whispered, stepping closer, her eyes never leaving mine. "Why are you doing this to me?" I choked out, my voice shaking. Her smile only widened. "Because I can, and because I know you." I knew then that this was more than just a stalking case. This was obsession. Claire had crossed a line, and now, she wasn't just playing with my mind. She was playing with my life. I had to get out of there. Now. I pushed her away, using every ounce of strength I had left, and ran to the door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I yanked it open and bolted down the stairs, out into the night. I didn't care where I was going. I just had to get away from her. As I ran through the dark streets, my mind raced. Claire knew everything about me, had learned every detail of my life. I was no longer sure if the person who had been stalking me was even the Claire I had met online. Was she real? Or was she some kind of twisted creation, a nightmare made flesh? I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep running from her. There was only one way out now. I had to make Claire think I was done running. I had to fight back. I spent the next few days making a plan. It wasn't just about running anymore. It was about confronting Claire, taking control of my life back. I couldn't keep hiding in fear. I had to face the nightmare she'd turned my life into. I gathered everything I could find. Security footage, messages, details about her online behavior. The police had been of no help so far, but I was determined to make them take this seriously. I compiled all of it into a file, ready to present the evidence. But there was one more thing I had to do. I had to make Claire think I was done, that I had given up. She was clever, and she could feel my fear. I needed to outsmart her. That night, I set up a meeting, an invitation for her to come to me. I used a burner phone to send a final message, pretending that I was ready to give in. "I'm done running. Let's meet. I'll be at the old warehouse near the docks. Come along." I knew this was risky, but was the only way to draw her out, to confront her face to face. I waited in the shadows of the warehouse, every muscle tense, every sense on high alert. The hours dragged on, and my anxiety grew. What if this was a trap? What if I was walking straight into her hands? Then, just before midnight, I heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate, and unmistakably hers. Claire stepped into the dim light, her eyes glowing with that same eerie intensity. She was smiling, but it wasn't the joyful smile I remembered from our early days. It was cold, calculating. "I knew you couldn't stay away," she said, her voice almost mocking. "You just needed to see me one last time." I stood tall, holding my ground. No, I needed to see you. I could feel the weight of the moment. This was it. I clicked a button on my phone, triggering a loud noise that echoed through the warehouse. The doors slammed shut behind Claire, locking her in. It wasn't just a trap for her. It was my escape. I had set up the place with security cameras, alarms, and a direct link to the police. The smile faded from Claire's face as she realized she had been caught. She tried to move, to escape, but the doors were sealed tight. Panic flickered in her eyes. I stepped forward, unwavering. "It's over, Claire. You don't control me anymore. I'm done with your game." For a moment, she didn't speak. Then, Her lips curled into something darker. You think this is the end? I'll never stop watching you. The door behind me opened, and 2 police officers entered, taking control of the situation. Claire tried to resist, but she was quickly subdued. As they escorted her out of the warehouse, I stood still, staring at the space where she had once haunted me. It was over. The nightmare had finally ended. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. There's no such thing as truly escaping from someone like Claire. I would never let my guard down again. In the fall of 2003, Sarah and James, a young couple in their late 20s, decided to leave the busy city life behind. They found an old farmhouse in the remote woods of West Virginia. The house was a bit rundown but full of charm, with a wraparound porch and a rustic bar nearby. It felt like the perfect place to start a new chapter of peace and quiet. The property was surrounded by thick, towering trees that seemed to stretch forever. The nearest town was 30 minutes away, and the closest neighbor was over a mile down the winding dirt road. "This is it," Sarah said, smiling as they unloaded their belongings. James agreed, happy to embrace the serenity of nature. The first few days were uneventful. The couple spent their time cleaning, unpacking, and exploring the property. At night, the house creaked and groaned, but they thought it was normal for a building over a century old. They slept soundly, enjoying the stillness of their new life. The first whistle. It was on the 5th night that Sarah heard it for the first time. She woke up around midnight to a faint sound coming from outside. It was soft and distant, a whistle. 3 short notes, followed by one long one. At first, she thought it might be the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, almost musical. "James," she whispered, nudging her husband awake. "Do you hear that?" James groaned, half asleep. "Hear what?" "The whistling," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. He sat up and listened for a moment, but the sound was gone. "Probably just the wind or an animal," he said, yawning. "Go back to sleep." Sarah tried to brush it off, but the sound stayed with her. It wasn't the wind. She was sure of it. The second night. The next night, Sarah heard it again. This time, it was closer. The same eerie tune floated through the night air. She didn't wake James, deciding she might be overthinking. Instead, she got out of bed, grabbed flashlight, and peered out the bedroom window. The backyard was dark, with only the faint glow of the moon illuminating the treetops. She couldn't see anyone or anything unusual. The whistling stopped as suddenly as it started. When she mentioned it to James the next morning, he laughed. "You're probably hearing coyotes or something. We're in the middle of the woods now, remember?" But Sarah couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. Closer and closer. By the 3rd night, the whistling had become impossible to ignore. This time, James heard it too. It started faint, like before, but gradually grew louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was making the sound was walking closer to the house. James grabbed a flashlight and headed to the back door. "Stay here," he told Sarah, who reluctantly nodded. The cold night air bit at his skin as he stepped onto the porch. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but nothing seemed out of place. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but the whistling had stopped. After a few minutes, James came back inside. "Nothing out there," he said, locking the door behind him. Sarah felt no relief. If it wasn't the wind or an animal, what was it? And why did it feel like someone or something was getting closer every night? The 4th night arrived, bringing with it an unsettling silence. The kind of quiet that feels heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Sarah and James stayed up late, trying to distract themselves with an old movie. The farmhouse felt colder than usual, and Sarah couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. As they turned off the lights and climbed into bed, Sarah hesitated. "What if it comes back tonight?" she whispered, her voice trembling. James sighed, trying to stay calm for both their sakes. "If it does, we'll figure it out. But it's probably nothing." But deep down, he was uneasy too. The whistle returns. At exactly 2:13 a.m., Sarah jolted awake. The whistle was back. This time, it wasn't faint or distant. It was right outside their bedroom window. 3 short notes. 1 long. Her heart raced as she froze, too scared to move. She reached over and shook James violently. "Wake up. It's here," she hissed. James sat up, listening intently. The sound was unmistakable now. The eerie tune drifted through the night, chilling them both to the bone. "I'm checking it out," James said, his voice firm. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and slipped on his shoes. "Don't go out there," Sarah pleaded, clutching his arm. "We can't just sit here," he replied, gently pulling away. "Stay inside and lock the door." Into the darkness, James stepped outside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The air was icy and still. The whistling had stopped again, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. He circled the house, his heart pounding with every step. The flashlight flickered, as if the batteries were dying, and shadows danced unnaturally around him. Near the edge of the woods, he thought he saw something move, a flash of pale skin disappearing behind a tree. "Who's there?" he called out, trying to sound braver than he felt. There was no response. Suddenly, the whistle came again, this time from the other side of the house. James spun around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. How had it moved so fast? He sprinted back to the house, slamming the door behind him. "Sarah, lock everything. We're not alone out here," he said, his voice trembling. Footprints in the morning. Neither of them slept for the rest of the night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sent their nerves spiraling. By morning, they mustered the courage to step outside together and look around in daylight. What they found made Sarah gasp. Bare footprints, large and oddly shaped, trailed from the woods to the back porch. The prints weren't human. They were too long, with claw-like impressions at the toes. "This isn't normal," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. James didn't respond. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "We're calling the police," he said firmly. A dead end. The officers arrived within an hour. They examined the footprints and checked the surrounding woods. But after hours of searching, they found no sign of anyone or anything. "It could be a prank," one of the officers suggested. "Kids messing around, maybe." James shook his head. Who would walk barefoot in the freezing cold? And those prints, they're not normal. The officer shrugged, offering little comfort. "If you see or hear anything else, give us a call." As they drove away, Sarah and James felt no safer. The footprints were still there, and they couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was whistling wasn't done with them yet. Closer still. That night, they double-checked every lock, every window, and every door. James kept a baseball bat by the bed, while Sarah clutched her phone, ready to call for help at the slightest noise. But the whistling didn't come. Instead, just as Sarah was beginning to relax, a loud thump echoed from the attic above their bedroom. The loud thump from the attic jolted Sarah and James out of their uneasy calm. They froze, staring at the ceiling above them. The sound wasn't subtle. It was heavy, deliberate, and far too close for comfort. "Is someone up there?" Sarah whispered, clutching James's arm. James grabbed the baseball bat by the bed, his knuckles white around the handle. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice low but resolute. "No," Sarah hissed. "Don't go alone." James hesitated but nodded. "Okay, stay close, but don't make a sound." With a flashlight in one hand and the bat in the other, James led the way down the hallway toward the attic hatch. The small wooden door was set into the ceiling above the hallway, with a pull string hanging down. The couple stood beneath it, their hearts racing. The attic door. James reached up, gripping the string. For a moment, he paused, as if debating whether he really wanted to open it. Then, with a quick pull, the attic door creaked open, and the old wooden ladder slid down with a groan. A faint, musty smell wafted down. The beam of the flashlight revealed dusty wooden beams and cobwebs. "Is anyone up there?" James called out, his voice firm but shaking slightly. There was no response. He started climbing the ladder, every step creaking beneath his weight. Sarah stayed at the bottom, clutching her phone in one hand and the edge of the ladder with the other. As James poked his head into the attic, he swung the flashlight around. The light swept across old furniture, boxes, and dusty insulation. At first, everything looked normal, but then he saw it. In the far corner of the attic, something was crouching. Its pale, skeletal form was hunched over, its long fingers gripping the wooden floorboards. Its back was to him, but its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if it were listening. James's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. The thing began to whistle. 3 short notes. 1 long. Run. Get down. James shouted, scrambling down the ladder as fast as he could. What did you see? Sarah cried, backing away as James hit the floor. There's something up there, he gasped, pulling the ladder shut and slamming the attic door. They ran back to their bedroom and locked the door, pushing a dresser against it for good measure. James's hands were shaking as he tried to explain. It wasn't human. I don't know what it was, but it was wrong. The whistling started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the attic. It was coming from the hallway, just outside their bedroom door. Trap. Sarah backed into the corner, clutching her phone. We need to call the police. James nodded, but before he could reach for his phone, the doorknob rattled. Something was trying to get in. James, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The whistling stopped, replaced by heavy, deliberate breathing. Whatever was outside the door was waiting. James tightened his grip on the baseball bat. If it gets in here, we fight. But deep down, they both knew this wasn't something they could fight. The rattling doorknob stopped. For a moment, there was complete silence. No breathing, no whistling, no creaking of the old house. Just an oppressive, eerie stillness that made Sarah and James hold their breath. What's it doing? Sarah whispered, barely audible. James shook his head, gripping the baseball bat so tightly his knuckles turned white. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a loud, scraping sound. It started low on the door and slowly climbed upward, like long, sharp nails dragging across the wood. Sarah's eyes widened in terror. It's trying to get in the hallway horror. James couldn't take it anymore. He took a deep breath, stepped toward the door, and swung open. The hallway was empty. The beam of his flashlight revealed nothing but shadows and the worn wooden floors. Where did it go? Sarah asked, clutching his arm. James didn't answer. He was staring at the floor outside the bedroom. There, in the dim light, were fresh claw marks gouged deep into the wood, leading down the hallway toward the living room. We need to get out of here, James whispered. Sarah nodded. The car. We'll drive to town and call someone for help. They grabbed their keys, and James kept the bat firmly in his grip. As they moved down the hallway, the old floorboards creaked beneath their feet, each sound making them flinch. The living room shadow. When they reached the living room, they stopped in their tracks. Something was standing in the corner, shrouded in shadows. Its unnaturally long limbs twisted and hunched as it swayed slightly, as if it was listening to a sound only it could hear. Its head was tilted upward, and even in the dim light, they could see its pale, skeletal face. It turned slowly toward them. The creature had no eyes, only deep, hollow sockets. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. It raised one long, clawed hand and pressed a finger to its lips, as if to shush them. Then it whistled. 3 short notes. 1 long. The escape. Run. James screamed, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward the front door. The creature didn't chase them. It simply stood there, its hollow sockets following their every move. James fumbled with the locks, his hands shaking as Sarah sobbed uncontrollably. Finally, the door flew open, and they sprinted to the car. The farmhouse loomed behind them, dark and silent, as James started the engine. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating the driveway and the edge of the woods. But as they backed out, the whistling started again. It wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the trees, The same haunting tune echoed all around them, louder and louder, as if the entire forest was alive with it. Shadows darted between the trees, too quick to make out, but unmistakably there. James slammed the car into drive and sped down the dirt road, the tires kicking up gravel as Sarah cried, "It's following us." The last glance. As they reached the edge of the property, Sarah dared one last look out the back window. The creature was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the red glow of the taillights. Its hollow sockets stared directly at her, and its lips stretched into a chilling grin. Then it raised its hand and waved. James didn't stop driving until they reached the outskirts of a nearest town, the old farmhouse, now miles behind them. Sarah was trembling in the passenger seat, clutching her phone but unable to dial. Her mind raced with the images of the creature, its hollow sockets, its unnerving grin, and that haunting whistle. James pulled into the parking lot of a small diner that was still lit, its neon sign flickering in the darkness. He killed the engine and turned to Sarah. "We need to call the police," he said, his voice unsteady. Sarah nodded, her fingers fumbling to dial the number. When the dispatcher picked up, Sarah stammered, "There's something at our house. It's not human. Please, you have to help us." The dispatcher tried to calm her down, asking for details, but neither Sarah nor James could explain what they'd seen. "We'll send someone to check the property," the dispatcher said finally. "For now, stay where you are." A familiar tune. As they sat in the car, waiting for any sign of the authorities, Sarah and James began to notice something strange. Even though they were miles away from the farmhouse, the air felt colder, and the silence outside grew heavier. Then, faintly, the whistle returned. 3 short notes. One long. Sarah froze. How is it here?" James gripped the baseball bat he had brought from the house, his eyes darting around the parking lot. The whistle grew louder, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. Inside the diner, a waitress looked up from wiping tables. She stared out the window at them, her face pale. Slowly, she walked to the door and locked it, pulling down the blinds. "What is she doing?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," James replied, "but we're not safe here." The waitress's warning. Unable to ignore their growing fear, James and Sarah got out of the car and ran to the diner's door, banging on it. The waitress hesitated but unlocked it and let them in, glancing nervously behind them. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly, locking the door again. "What do you mean?" James asked, his voice rising in panic. "What's going on?" The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, sighed and motioned for them to sit down. "I've heard about that whistle before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People around here talk about it. Always out in the woods, always near that old farmhouse. Folks say it's been around for generations." "What is it?" Sarah asked, clutching James's arm. The woman shook her head. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's a spirit, others say it's something older, something that doesn't belong in this world. But once you hear it, it doesn't stop. It follows you. It waits." James's stomach dropped. "How do we stop it?" The waitress looked at them, her face grim. "You don't. You can run, but it'll always find you." A knock on the window. Before they could say more, a loud knock echoed through the diner. The 3 of them froze, staring at the glass window near the booth where Sarah and James were sitting. The blinds were drawn, but a shadow loomed on the other side, tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally. The whistle began again, muffled but unmistakable. 3 short notes. One long. "It's here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The waitress backed away, her hands trembling. "You need to leave. Now." "But it's outside," James shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Exactly," the waitress said. "And if you stay here, it'll come inside." The relentless pursuit. With no other options, Sarah and James bolted back to their car. The whistle followed them, growing louder with every step. James started the engine, and they sped out of the parking lot, the shadowy figure shrinking in the rearview mirror. As they drove, Sarah clung to James's arm. "What do we do? Where can we go?" "I don't know," James admitted, his voice breaking. "But we can't stop." The whistle continued, echoing through the night, as if it was inside their heads. For now, they were alive, but deep down, they both knew the truth. The whistling wouldn't stop. It would find them again, and next time, it might not let them go. The car sped down the highway, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Sarah kept glancing out the back window, convinced she'd see the creature chasing them. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his focus split between the road and the growing sense of dread that filled the air. The whistle, faint but persistent, seemed to follow them, carried on the wind. "I can't take this anymore," Sarah cried, her voice breaking. "We can't just keep running." "What do you want me to do, Sarah?" James snapped, his frustration and fear spilling over. "I don't know what it is, and I don't know how to stop it." Sarah opened her phone, desperately searching for answers. She typed phrases like whistling ghost, haunted farmhouse, and creature that whistles. Most of the results were useless: urban legends, horror stories, and speculation. But one post stood out: the legend of the Whistling One. The post was on an obscure forum dedicated to paranormal phenomena. It described a local legend from the region, known as the Whistling One. According to the story, the creature was neither ghost nor human. It was a being summoned long ago by a desperate family living near the woods. The family, struggling to survive a harsh winter, had turned to forbidden rituals for help. They summoned the Whistling One, promising it their loyalty in exchange for food and warmth. But when the spring came, the family broke their vow. They tried to leave the area, thinking they could escape their debt. Instead, the creature cursed them and their land, binding their spirits to the house. The Whistling One lingered, waiting for anyone who dared disturb its domain. The final line of the post sent chills down Sarah's spine. "Once you hear its whistle, it claims you. Run, fight, hide. It doesn't matter. It always collects its due." Sarah read the post aloud, her voice trembling. "It's claiming us, James. That's why it won't stop." James slammed his fist on the steering wheel. There has to be a way to break the curse. There has to be. A desperate detour. The post mentioned a local historian named Edith Crane, who had spent her life researching folklore and paranormal cases in the area. Sarah quickly searched for her contact information and found an address. "She lives about 30 miles from here," Sarah said. "We have to find her." James nodded. "It's the only lead we've got." As they turned onto a narrow country road, the whistling grew louder, as if the creature knew they were trying to stop it. The air grew colder, and the car's headlights flickered. "We're running out of time," James muttered, pressing the gas pedal harder. Edith Crane's house. They arrived at a small, isolated cottage surrounded by dense trees. The house was old but well kept, with a warm light glowing in the windows. James and Sarah ran to the front door and pounded on it. An elderly woman opened the door, her gray hair tied back in a neat bun. She wore thick glasses and had a sharp, curious expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm despite their frantic appearance. "Are you Edith Crane?" Sarah asked, breathless. The woman nodded. "We need your help," James said. "There's something after us. Something that whistles." At the mention of the whistle, Edith's expression darkened. She stepped aside, motioning them in. "Come inside, quickly." A grim revelation. Inside, Edith listened as James and Sarah described their experience, her face growing graver with every detail. When they finished, she stood and began pulling books from her shelves. "You're dealing with a cursed entity," she said matter-of-factly. "The Whistling One is bound to its land, but once it marks someone, it doesn't stop until it takes what it's owed." "What does it want?" Sarah asked. "Your lives," Edith replied bluntly. "It feeds on fear and suffering. The more terrified you are, the stronger it becomes." James clenched his fists. "There has to be a way to stop it." "There might be," Edith said, flipping through an ancient, leather-bound book. "But it's dangerous. The ritual to banish the Whistling One requires confronting it directly. On its land, you'd have to return to the farmhouse. Sarah's heart sank. We can't go back there. You don't have a choice, Edith said. If you don't face it, it will keep coming, no matter where you go. The decision. James and Sarah exchanged a long, fearful look. The idea of returning to the farmhouse felt like walking into their own graves, but running wasn't an option anymore. We'll do it, James said finally, his voice firm despite the fear in his eyes. Tell us what we need to do. Edith nodded solemnly. Prepare yourselves. This will be the fight of your lives. Edith placed an old leather-bound book on the table. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, the text handwritten in faded ink. Symbols and illustrations of strange figures filled the margins. This is the only record I've found on how to banish the Whistling One, she said, pointing to a page with a crude drawing of a figure eerily similar to what Sarah and James had seen. What do we have to do? James asked, his voice steady but tense. Edith traced her finger down the text. The ritual requires you to stand your ground on its land. It will try to break you, to feed on your fear. You must resist. And if we don't, Sarah whispered, it will kill you, Edith said bluntly, and your souls will be trapped, like the others who failed before you. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The others? Edith nodded. The spirits tied to the farmhouse. They were people once, just like you. Some tried to fight, others didn't. All of them lost. The ritual. Edith began explaining the steps of the ritual. Salt circle. You must draw a perfect circle of salt around you. It's your only protection. If it breaks, you're vulnerable. Summoning chant. Recite this chant to call the Whistling One into the circle. It will become visible, but it will also become more aggressive. Confrontation. You must speak directly to it, using its true name to weaken it. The name is here, Edith said, pointing to a symbol in the book, but it's in an ancient language. You'll need to practice saying it. The final step. If the ritual works, the entity will be bound to its domain and unable to leave, but it will fight to stop you. James and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances. The task sounded impossible, but what choice did they have? Preparation. Edith handed them a bag filled with supplies, a container of salt, candles, a lighter, and a copy of the chant written phonetically. You need to go back tonight, she said. It grows stronger with every passing hour. As they packed the car, Edith stopped them. One last thing, she said, handing James a small iron dagger. This is for protection. It won't kill it, but if it gets too close, this might slow it down. James nodded, tucking the dagger into his jacket. Good luck, Edith said. You'll need it. The return to the farmhouse. The drive back to the farmhouse was silent. The road felt longer, the darkness heavier. The whistle returned before they even reached the property. Faint but insistent, as if it knew they were coming. When they arrived, the house loomed in the headlights, its windows dark and uninviting. Sarah's stomach churned as she stepped out of the car, clutching the bag of supplies. Let's get this over with, James said, his voice steady despite the fear etched on his face. They made their way to the living room, where the air felt thick and cold. James poured the salt onto the floor, creating a circle wide enough for both of them. He lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. Are you ready? James asked. No, Sarah admitted, her voice trembling. But we have to do this. The Whistling One appears. As James began the chant, the whistle grew louder, filling the room. The shadows deepened, and the temperature plummeted. The creature appeared in the corner of the room, its long limbs twisting as it stepped into the dim candlelight. Its hollow sockets locked onto them, and its jagged mouth curled into a grin. It whistled, 3 short notes. 1 long. Keep going, Sarah urged, gripping James's arm. The creature lunged at the salt circle, but the barrier held. It hissed, its skeletal face contorted in rage. James's voice wavered as he reached the final line of the chant. The creature howled, the sound echoing through the house, shaking the walls. Say its name. Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. James took a deep breath and shouted the ancient name, his voice ringing through the room. The creature froze, its body writhing as if in pain. The whistle turned into a distorted screech, and the room was filled with a blinding light. The aftermath. When the light faded, the creature was gone. The house was silent, and the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. James and Sarah sat in the circle, breathing heavily. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I think so," James replied, though his hands still shook. They gathered their things and left the house, not daring to look back. As they drove away, the whistle didn't follow. For the first time in days, they felt a glimmer of hope. But deep in the woods, a faint whistle echoed through the trees. James and Sarah reached the edge of town just as dawn began to break. The faint light of morning brought a sense of relief, though exhaustion weighed heavy on their shoulders. They pulled into a motel parking lot, too drained to continue driving. Inside their room, they sat in silence for a long time. Neither of them wanted to acknowledge the lingering unease that clung to their thoughts. "It's gone," James said finally, trying to convince himself as much as Sarah. "We did it. We beat it." Sarah nodded slowly, but didn't reply. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that their ordeal wasn't truly over. The shadow of doubt. The day passed uneventfully. They stayed indoors, too scared to venture far from each other. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah's anxiety grew. "Do you feel different?" she asked James as they sat by the motel window, watching the empty parking lot. James frowned. "What do you mean?" Like it's still out there." "Watching." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah, we're just shaken up. That thing was whatever it was. It's enough to mess anyone up. But Edith said the ritual worked. It's bound to that house now." Sarah nodded, but didn't feel reassured. She couldn't forget the faint whistle she thought she heard in the woods as they left the farmhouse. The whistle returns. Around midnight, Sarah jolted awake. At first, she wasn't sure what had woken her. The room was silent, except for the hum of the motel's air conditioner. She glanced at James, who was fast asleep on the other bed. Then she heard it. Faint, distant. 3 short notes. One long. Her blood ran cold. She sat up, straining to hear. The whistle came again, slightly louder this time. It was outside. "James," she whispered urgently, shaking him awake. "What is it?" he mumbled groggy. "Listen." James rubbed his eyes and sat up. The whistle came again, clearer now, as if it were just outside their door. "No," James said, his voice filled with denial. "That's impossible. We ended it." But the whistle didn't care for their beliefs. A knock at the door. The whistle stopped suddenly, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Then a slow, deliberate knock echoed through the room. Knock, knock, knock. Sarah's breathing quickened, and James grabbed the iron dagger Edith had given them, clutching it tightly. "Who's there?" James shouted, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. No response. He stepped cautiously toward the door, gesturing for Sarah to stay back. Peering through the peephole, his heart stopped. There was nothing there, but as he turned away, the whistle returned, this time inside the room. The truth revealed. Sarah screamed as the shadows in the corner of the room twisted and contorted, forming the familiar figure of the whistling one. Its hollow eyes bore into them, its jagged mouth curling into that grotesque grin. "You said it was bound," Sarah cried, backing into the corner. James raised the dagger, his hand shaking. "Stay back." The creature didn't move closer, but let out a low, guttural laugh. Its voice was distorted, echoing like many voices speaking at once. "You cannot bind me," it hissed. "I do not belong to this world or any other. You are marked. You will always be mine." James lunged with the dagger, but the creature vanished, reappearing behind him. It grabbed his wrist, its icy touch burning like fire. "James!" Sarah screamed, throwing the bag of salt at the creature. The salt spilled onto the floor, and the creature hissed, retreating momentarily. A desperate escape. "Run!" James shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand. They bolted from the room, leaving everything behind. The whistle followed them, growing louder and more frantic. They jumped into their car and sped away, the motel shrinking in the rearview mirror. The whistle didn't stop, echoing in their ears no matter how far they drove. "This isn't over," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "It'll never stop." James gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel tightly. "Then we'll find another way. We'll keep fighting." But deep down, they both knew the truth. The Whistling One wasn't just bound to Farmhouse. It was bound to them. James and Sarah drove aimlessly through the night, their only goal being to put as much distance as possible between them and the motel. But no matter how far they went, the faint whistle remained, always just on the edge of hearing. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, but neither of them felt the usual relief that daylight brought. Exhaustion tugged at them both, but stopping felt like an invitation for the Whistling One to finish what had started. "We can't keep running," Sarah said, her voice hoarse. "It's not going to stop, James. We need help." James nodded grimly. "But who?" "Edith said the ritual was our best chance, and it didn't work. What else is there?" Sarah hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "There has to be someone who knows more. Maybe we missed something." She scrolled through forums, old articles, and paranormal blogs until she found a mention of a man named Father Gabriel, a priest who had spent decades studying and combating supernatural forces. "He's in the next state over," Sarah said, holding up the address she'd found. "It's a long shot, but he might know something." James glanced at the fuel gauge, which was dangerously close to empty. "Let's hope he's worth it, because we're running out of options and gas." The meeting with Father Gabriel. Several hours later, they pulled into the gravel driveway of a small, weathered church nestled in a forest clearing. The building looked ancient, its stones darkened by time and moss, and its tall, arched windows glinting in the midday sun. Father Gabriel greeted them at the door. He was an older man with a kind but weary face, his eyes sharp with intelligence. "You've encountered something terrible," he said the moment he saw them, his voice calm but firm. "I can feel its presence lingering around you." James and Sarah exchanged nervous glances. "It's called the Whistling One," James explained. "We thought we banished it, but it's still after us." Father Gabriel's expression darkened. He led them into his office, a room filled with books, relics, and candles that flickered even though there was no breeze. "I've heard of this entity," he said, pulling a thick, leather-bound book from a shelf. "It is ancient, far older than the farmhouse it haunts. It thrives on fear and despair, feeding on the souls of those it marks. We tried a ritual to bind it," Sarah said, "but it didn't work. It's like it's attached to us now." Father Gabriel nodded. "The ritual you performed was incomplete. The Whistling One isn't bound by simple incantations or barriers. Its connection to you must be severed directly at its source." James frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Gabriel said, "you must face it where it was first summoned and destroy the object that binds it to this world, the source of the curse." Gabriel explained that the Whistling One's power stemmed from an artifact buried beneath the farmhouse, a relic used in the original summoning ritual centuries ago. "The artifact serves as a tether between this world and its own," Gabriel said. "As long as it exists, the Whistling One cannot be destroyed." "Let me guess," James said, his tone bitter. "We have to go back." Gabriel nodded. "Yes, but this time, you will not face it alone." Preparations for the final confrontation. Gabriel gathered holy relics, protective talismans, and a sacred blade, an ancient weapon blessed by generations of priests. "This blade will not kill it, but it will weaken it long enough for you to destroy the artifact," Gabriel said. "But be warned, the creature will do everything in its power to stop you. It knows that if you succeed, its connection to this world will be severed." James took the blade, feeling its weight in his hand. "What happens if we fail?" Gabriel's expression was grim. "If you fail, it will consume you. and its power will grow even stronger. The return to the farmhouse. As night fell, James, Sarah, and Gabriel arrived at the farmhouse. The property was shrouded in an unnatural fog, and the air felt thick with malevolence. The whistle started as soon as they stepped out of the car, faint but mocking. Gabriel lit a lantern and handed it to Sarah. "Stay close to me. Whatever happens, do not let fear take hold. Fear is its weapon." The three of them entered the house, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The whistle grew louder, echoing through the halls. Shadows danced on the walls, shifting and twisting like living things. Gabriel led them to the basement, a place James and Sarah had avoided during their first visit. The air grew colder with every step they descended. At the center of the basement was a small, dirt-covered box half buried in the ground. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, glowing faintly in the dim light. "That's it," Gabriel said. "The artifact, the final battle." Before they could move, the whistling one materialized at the far end of the room. Its skeletal figure towered over them, its hollow eyes burning with malice. It let out a piercing whistle that rattled the walls and sent shivers down their spines. Gabriel stepped forward, holding up a talisman. "By the power of the light, I banish you." The creature screeched, recoiling from the talisman, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it lunged, its long limbs reaching for James and Sarah. James swung the sacred blade, slicing through the creature's arm. It howled in pain, black smoke pouring from the wound. "Destroy the artifact," Gabriel shouted. "Now." Sarah dropped to her knees, clawing at the dirt around the box. The whistle grew deafening, and the creature thrashed, its form flickering between solid and shadow. James fought to keep it at bay, each swing of the blade weakening it further. Gabriel chanted prayers, his voice unwavering despite the chaos. Finally, Sarah unearthed the box. She hesitated for only a moment before smashing it against the ground. The whistle stopped abruptly, and the creature let out a final, blood-curdling scream before disintegrating into a cloud of ash. The silence that followed was deafening. Aftermath. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the air felt lighter. Gabriel helped Sarah to her feet, his face etched with exhaustion, but also relief. "It's over," he said. James dropped the blade, his hands shaking. "Is it really gone?" Gabriel nodded. "Without the artifact, it cannot return to this world." As they stepped out of the farmhouse and into the cool night air, Sarah took a deep breath, feeling hope for the first time in days. The whistle was gone, but somewhere in the woods, the faintest echo lingered.